Hello, welcome to this next Substance Painter tutorial. In this tutorial, we're going to have a look through the baking options we've got. And I'm starting in ZBrush because I'm just showing you what I've prepared. So I have this terrible rock that I've sculpted. You have to bear with me, I'm not very experienced with ZBrush, so yeah, might not look very good. And this is at 6 subdivisions currently to get all this lovely detail in. And if I go down through the subdivisions, I'll eventually get to my lowest subdivision, which is, my lowish polygon model. It's not the lowest in the world, it's not the highest in the world, it's pretty low. So it's 1,200 points, whereas my full one is 1.27 million points. Which is, not going to be handled very well, if I have lots of them at least, in some sort of render engine, video game or otherwise. So what I want to do is maintain this detail, but on the low poly mesh. So to do that, I am at my highest subdivision, and for some reason ZBrush has decided it's going to have a think about it for a while. It's probably my PC. I've probably been using it so long, working on this, that I've overtaxed my memory with various memory leaks and such like. Yeah, well, oh, there we go. I was about to cancel. Okay, so what I want to do is export this model. So I'm going to hit export, and I'm going to export it to a rock _high for me. And then I'll click OK, and this is going to chug along the top. Depending upon how big your model is, or how big your high poly is, will depend on how little this takes. It can take a few minutes. And then I'm going to go all the way down to my lowest and export again, and this time the low poly model. As you can see, there's quite a difference between the two. I've got 112k versus 143,000. So yes, there we go. Okay, so now we can nip over to Substance. If I can find it, where is it? Have I closed it? I probably have. Oh, I didn't think I closed it. Whoops. There we go. I'll speed this up while my Substance launches. There we go. Told you it was a clunker. Right, so now I need to go File and New. I'm going to set my resolution to 2048 and then select my low poly mesh. Everything else is fine. If you haven't unwrapped your model, you can always use the auto unwrap, which will give you at least something to work on. And then click OK, and that should come in. There we go. And there's my lovely low poly mesh. No detail on it, nothing at all. So to get our detail, we need to bake from that high poly mesh. So we click on this little baking icon up here, which is cleverly depicted by a croissant. And this is what we see. Now, I'm not exactly seeing my model here. What I'm seeing is this UV cage. So if I open that up and turn that cage off and the wireframe, now I can see my low poly model. But these are important when we actually import our high mesh. So we do that over here in the general or the common settings. Under high def meshes, we click this document button and import our high one. And because it's a high res model, it will take a moment or two to think about it, and then it will display this. So now we're getting a difference between our high and low poly. I'm going to turn the cages off because this is the actual difference between the two. So the lighter areas are our low poly mesh, and these more detailed blue areas are our high poly mesh. And the cage is there to show us where the intersection is too far. So the cage itself, this projection cage surface, is how far the baker will project a ray before it stops. So if something is outside this cage, it won't get captured. And you can tell what's outside the cage if I put this down to 0 by any red areas. This is a bit exaggerated, of course, but you know, you'll often find some small areas poking out and they will turn red. So the first thing to do is just go around your model and make sure there's no red areas. And if there are, let me increase this a little bit. Whoops, that's way too much. There we go. If there are, you'll see something more like this, where, you know, the projection distance is not far enough. So in that case, what we're going to do is just set this to a value where there are now no red areas. If you go too far out like this, you'll find that your cage gets distorted and, you know, twisted, and in which case it's not going to work very well. So don't just set it out to a huge number to make sure everything fits in, because, you know, if you have a very intricate model with lots of tight turns and twists, you're likely to make the cage poke through itself, and you'll get baking issues there too. It's one of the reasons that I've stuck with such a straightforward model, because, you know, for demonstration purposes, you know, this is going to be much easier. Okay, so normally the first thing you do is set your opacity first thing after doing your cage, and then you hit the bake. So once that's baked through, we'll be able to have a look at our maps. So if you don't want to go back to the painting mode to see your maps, we need to turn our cages off, and we also need to turn our high def mesh off. So now I'm viewing my low definition mesh with all that detail baked in. And as we can see, we've got some nice surface detail. We've got little things that I carved in there, all that detail that we'd lost or would lose if we didn't use the bake. And that's great. So that's the normal part of it, but there are other aspects to the baking tool, which we're going to go through in the next couple of sections. Yeah, so I'll talk to you then. Okay, so we've got our normal bake done, but now we're going to have a look at some of these other maps. So the two that I use most are Ambient Occlusion and Curvature. And I say I use most, I find that they are possibly one of the more, well, they're the most commonly used. And as we build the texture in a few minutes, we'll have a look at that. So first I'm going to deselect all mesh maps, and then select Ambient Occlusion and go and have a look at the Ambient Occlusion channel. And as you can see, it's a very bright map with some very pale dark kind of pieces on it. There are a couple of things we can do to change that. First of all, under distribution, it works on cosine as default. I'm going to switch that to uniform and then rebake, and we should see then we start to get a lot of, you know, a lot more detail into it. So other than that, we can have a look at the ground plane. So, you know, this rock is going to be sitting on a ground plane, so perhaps I want the occlusion from that. So if we turn on the ground plane, and we can adjust its position, but I'm going to leave it as is. We'll click Bake Selected, and now we should see that the ground plane is contributing to, you know, the dark areas at the bottom. In terms of occlusion distances, you can play with that, of course. We can increase that. If I like to increase things to max just to really demonstrate. You'll see that that looks like a much softer kind of effect. rather than getting really fine details, we're getting broader details, and it's giving me a nicer kind of look around my little rune carving there. But if I go perhaps somewhere in the middle, we'll get a good compromise where we'll get a little bit more detail, but a little bit more, you know, a little softness to that detail as well. So it's entirely up to you whether you want to do, you know, have a softer map or a harder map. I sort of edge towards the middle. Okay, so that's the ambient occlusion map. In the next one, we'll have a look at the curvature map. Okay, so let's have a look at the curvature map. So if I go to curvature and turn off ambient occlusion and switch over to the curvature map, we can see it's a much busier map. There's a lot more going on. And basically, to read a map like this, where it's like a neutral grey, there is no change in angle between points. So, you know, a flat grey, you're looking at a flat plane. Where we get our very dark greys, that's where you have a negative change in angle. And where we have our lighter white and grey colours, that's a positive angle. So saying that in English, where it's darker, you've got a cavity. Where it's lighter, you've got an edge. And, you know, we can utilise that in certain generators to, you know, put different effects on different areas. Okay, so you might notice that there is some kind of sketching going on here, a bit of juddering, and I want to get rid of that a little bit. So first of all, I turn my secondary rays up, which I normally do for both ambient occlusion and curvature. And I'm also going to increase my sampling radius to somewhere around half. And then I'll rebake that. And now you can see we get a much softer thing there. All that juddering has gone. Now, if you go too far with this, you'll blur out most of your detail. So if I go all the way to 1, you'll see that it's a much fuzzier map. 0.5 I usually use as a starter point to see if I'm losing too much detail. And I can always reduce it until I get a good balance. See here I'm getting a little bit of that juddering, so I'm going to increase it, say, to 0.4 and then go from there. And I can see some of it now, but I have more detail, so I think that's a good compromise. Okay, so what else have we got here? So we have our rays and sampling. We do have a generate from normal map, which is an old version, which you can use. We have relative to bounding box. If I turn that off, you probably won't see too much in the way of difference. In fact, all my juddering's come back, so my sampling radius would need to go up to accommodate for that. But this is essentially, you know, what I find the difference is. If you have relative to bounding box on, you cannot go over this number, this sampling radius. If you turn relative to bounding box off, we can go above that. So it really rather depends on what you're trying to do and whether you're, you know, trying to get this sort of effect where, you know, we've obliterated almost all detail and just have very broad strokes. So I tend to leave relative to bounding box on. I think that was at 0.4-ish when we baked it, because in this particular instance I do want a bit of detail. Okay, auto tone mapping. If I turn that off, we're going to get something like this. So now we literally have a black and white thing, and this will allow you then to adjust your tone mapping to your, you know, to your requirements. I wouldn't know one end of a tone map from another, frankly, in this particular instance, so I tend to leave it on. There we go. Okay, so that's the curvature map. These other maps generally just work. Thickness is something I would use if I had sort of a model with very thin areas and very chunky areas, and thereby I could, get it to focus on the thin areas or the chunky areas, in our texturing process. I'm not using height, bent normals, or opacity. Opacity speaks for itself. Bent normals, I believe, is a newer thing which I'm not 100% familiar with or confident in explaining. And then height map is if you've got some very big changes in mesh and you want a height map to take those into account. Okay, so I hope that was useful. In the next section or two, I'm going to build a quick kind of stony rock texture for this, and show you, where these maps are used and how we can, get some good results out of them. Okay, so I will talk to you in the next section. Okay, so once you've got all your maps as you want them, I'm going to switch over to the material channel and then use the return to painting mode button. And now we have our rock all ready to go. So I'm going to get rid of our base painting there. Now, a very good one, starter material here is concrete simple. So if I drag and drop that into our stack, we'll get, a fairly simple rock, which is not bad at all, really. I might want to change the projection type there to try planar to avoid any awkward seams. And in this case, I've got some white features going over my runes there. So I'm just going to use the gizmo to move that out of the way a little bit. I move it up or down. Yeah, I just want it out of the way. Okay, so that's our base texture, and that's what we're going to do. And one of the first things we're going to do is work on our cavities. So what I'm going to do is duplicate this layer, and then in its properties, we're going to go into technical parameters and take luminosity down, because I want this to be darker than the original. And then we'll add a black mask to that, and to that black mask we'll add a generator, and the generator we'll pick is curvature. There we go. So the easiest way to see this is to actually switch over to the mask. So where it's white, it's going to show through, and where it's dark, it's going to let the lower layer show through. So this is opposite to what we want, and you might think that you can just press invert for that, but a better option is to go under curvature and change the mode from edges to cavities, and now it's just highlighting our cavities. So once we've done that, we can actually adjust how this mask is created from the cavity mask. So currently it's using all these options. So we've got huge, big, large, medium, soft, fine and sharp. And they're decreasing or increasing levels of detail essentially. So if I take the sharp out, we're going to get the very fine detail gone. If we take the fine out, we'll get the fine detail gone, and so on and so forth as we go down. So you can adjust these to remove or increase different levels in your mask. I want to remove some of these, really. Whoops, there we go. I think that's probably somewhere about right. Okay, so when I go back to my material view, I should now see that we've got some things going on, and it's reasonably subtle, but you can see in the little rune area there we've got some darker areas. So One other thing in your generator here is the global blur, global balance, and global contrast. And we can adjust these to get more or less of our result. So as global balance is going up, you'll see that I'm getting a little bit more in there. And if I increase global contrast, actually not a lot's happening. Best thing to do, as always, is go and have a look at the mask. So if I take global balance down to where it more or less started, we can see what global contrast does. And global contrast essentially, you know, the higher up you go, the more contrast there is. So it's either black or it's white, and it's going to, you know, really break up your detail there. Whereas global balance has a tendency to push everything, you know, more towards white, if you like. And then we have a blur where we can blur our detail. So let's go and have a look at our material. And I've got some quite nice difference there. So that's your cavities essentially. You can adjust it either through curvature, and then once you've got curvature about right, we can adjust our global properties. I'm just going to mess around in here a little bit just to see if I can get a slightly nicer result. And it's marginal. Okay, so that's our cavities. In the next one we'll have a look at doing the same but with edges. So for edges it's much the same. So what we'll do is duplicate this layer, and then on the material itself, under technical parameters, I'm going to increase luminosity. As you can see, that's just doing it in the cavities at the moment, and that's because we can just adjust our curvature here. If we come under curvature, we'll go to edges, and we get quite a different result. Let's have a look at our map or our mask, and then we can adjust until we're somewhere closer to where we want. So I think that's quite nice, except to say I think I've got too many large features in it, so I'm going to dial down some of those features until I get a slightly more broken but focused around the facets on this rock. There we go. Let's go and have a look at that in the material. There we go. So that looks kind of okay, but it's a little bit harsh. So what I'm going to do is increase our global blur, maybe our balance and blur perhaps, to get a more, you know, soft and natural, soft and more natural, not naturaler, I don't know what that means, effect. Okay, so that's kind of broad edges. In the next bit we'll have a look at what we want to do for, you know, much tighter edges. So I'll talk to you then. Okay, so now we'll put some tighter highlights in this. So I'm just going to right click and duplicate that top layer there, and then I'm going to adjust this curvature. So if we open up curvature, I'm going to go over to my mask so I can get a nice view, and now we can mess about. So I'm going to take the blur down. There we go. And then if I increase contrast, I'll get a much tighter, it will be basically white or black, you know, at the maximum. So I'm going to take it up just a little bit, and then I'm going to start to take out some of the details here. So if I take them all out, we'll get an idea of what we get as we go. So I want these very sharp, and I want the fine, but it's quite possible I don't want any more than that. Once I start to go even further to the soft details, it's getting a bit over much. So I just want that much really. I want to highlight around the runes and pick up some sharp detail. So let's go back and have a look at our material view, and now we can see that that is coming through good and strong. So we can adjust that a little bit if I update my global blur, but I often find that actually just adding a filter, so right click, add filter, and then adding the blur gives me more control. So I want it to be more detailed, but I still want it to be a little soft. I don't want it to be, you know, super sharp. It's getting quite sharp around here, but you know, around the runes and around some other areas, it's much, much softer. So the reason I do that is if I turn that off and turn my blur up on the global here, you'll find that it disappears quite quickly. So using the blur filter gives me a little bit of extra option. There we go. So that's picked up some tighter areas. I'm not changed the material ever so much because I'm not blurring it. I'm getting more of the brightness coming through. Let's go and have a look at our roughness map. So our roughness map is fairly uniform currently, and you know, it's quite possible that I want to change that in certain areas. So if I have a look at the technical parameters, sometimes you'll find a roughness under there. In this case I do not. We've got some cracks, we've got some dirtiness, but that's not really giving us our effect. So all I'm going to do is right click and add a fill. That was a paint, wasn't it? Just Control Z, right click, add a fill, and then turn off everything except rough. And now I can control the rough on that area. So you'll see it's only going to apply where the mask shows through. So I can really change that roughness to get some contrast between the background and the foreground. And I could do that same trick on the other layers. For example, on this second layer where we darken things up, I could right click and add a fill to that one, alt click the rough, and then I can make that rougher too. Maybe not as rough as the edges, but I can still put some variation in. And it's all about variation, but not necessarily large variations. Okay, so let's go back, have a look at our material, and that's what we have now, and it's looking quite nice. Next, I'm going to use one of the position options to work on the bottom. I want this to sit on the floor. Perhaps it's been you know, sitting on a wet ground or something, and you know, I can darken it and shiny it up. Righty-ho, so we'll do that next. Okay, so we want to place this firmly on the ground. So I'm just going to add a new layer, just default so it shows up everything. And then right click, add black mask, and then right click, add generator. And this generator we use position. So initially when this comes in, this is going to give me a top to bottom position gradient, which is going to put everything on the top, which is not what I want. So let's go to mask and we can see exactly what's going. So anything that's white will show, anything that's darker will not, or towards black, and then various in the middle. So we can open our position control and adjust our top to bottom here. And we can open it up, and there's a few options here, nothing very exciting. But first thing I'll do is invert it. So once I've inverted it, it's going to behave a little bit oddly. So I'm just going to take it quite a long way down, and then we're going to change our balances. So if I change my balance up really high, we'll get grey going, very far up. And if I increase my global contrast, oops, if I can grab it, it might damn thing's locked up again. So take my contrast, got my global contrast. I can adjust between the two of these to get to where I want. Somewhere around there, I think. Okay, so what I want to do now is break this up. So to do that, we add in a fill layer, and in our textures, I'm going to look for grunge. So I want something that's quite directional, similar to this one here. So I'll drag and drop that one in, and then we'll get that. I'm going to change the projection, whoops, not that one, to triplanar, and now we're getting that directional kind of look. So once we've done that, now we're overriding our position gradient under here. I'm going to change it from normal to multiply, and now I get quite a nice variate pattern along the bottom. Variate, is that a word? I'm not sure. Okay, so to bring my thing a little brighter, we'll add levels, and I'm just going to adjust my input there until I get to a nice sort of level. There we go. Okay, so back to our material, and now I should have somewhere around the bottom all this white going on. If I turn it off, you'll be able to see it better. There we go. And what I'm going to do on this one is I'm not going to use a concrete. I'm going to go back to materials, and I'm going to use something a little bit still vaguely organic, but not not rocky. So I'm going to use this leather rough, and you can see that adds in some, say, dirt and such like to the bottom. I can change the colour here to make it a little darker. Oops, and we can change the projection to triplanar to avoid any weird kind of I'm trying to say weird seams. That's it. And I'm going to go back to my roughness map and have a look. See, this leather is very rough, and we just happen to have a roughness option here. So I'm going to bring this quite far down to give this a kind of a more wetness at the bottom. So it's been sitting on damp ground, that sort of thing. So then we'll go back to material, and there we go. We've got some vaguely wet, sort of dirty patches around the bottom, which is starting to add a little detail. So next then, the last thing I'm going to do on this one is I'm going to lighten the top using the position gradient again. So I'll talk to you then. So on the top then, it's been exposed to the weather and the wind and the sun, and it's kind of faded a little bit. So what I'm going to do is add a new fill layer. Going to right click and add a black mask, and then we'll add in our generator again. We'll use the position gradient, and this time it's coming in the right direction, which is lovely. So we can adjust this. Let's go to the mask to see clearer. And I don't want it down here, I want it, almost certainly just up the top. So let's reduce that down a little bit. There we go. I can increase the global balance to make the top a little lighter, and then reduce this again. Yeah, I think it's going to be over and over again for that one. Okay, so for this one, we might want to add in some variation. So I'm going to right click and add another fill layer. This time I'm not really concerned about directionalness, I want more patchiness. So I'm going to have a look in my grunges and see what I've got. Let's go down. I know I've got sort of spotty ones somewhere. This one, I think. So let's drag and drop that onto there. Switch over to triplanar to avoid anything odd. And there we go. That's not too bad. If you want to reposition this at all, you've got gizmos up here. So I could rotate this a little bit perhaps to, whoops, come on. Let's get some more features on the top if I wanted to. And then switch it over to multiply. And yeah, this is sort of implying to me that my position gradient is not strong enough. It's a little bit too, yeah, a bit too plain. So I'm going to take my contrast down and increase my top to bottom. Let's take the balance down a little bit. There we go. Now we're getting there. So we've got this kind of harsh edge coming in here, but in theory, with the with our grunge map here, that should, you know, break that up nicely. Okay, so let's have a look what we've got here. So now I can see those spots, but perhaps, you know, we want them to be different in some way. You know, we don't want them to be just the same white as the other ones. Perhaps we want, you know, a different colour. So let's see if we can find a material that might help us. A leather might help us again. Where's that gone? It's around here somewhere. Got leather rough, lizard scales. I think leather rough is probably as good as I'm going to get. So I'll drop that on. So it's coming brown now, but I want it to be much paler. But I don't want it to be brown. I want it to be a little bit more green for that growing lichen kind of touch. I think I want it to be a bit darker than that. It's a little bit too, how can I put it? Yeah, not good is the best I can come up with. Okay, so what have we done? We've built some maps. We've utilised those maps to get us different effects. We've used cavities and edges. We've adjusted our generators to, you know, get the kind of look we want, and we have a rock which doesn't look too bad, I think. I'm sure you could do much better than I. I'm sticking to default assets, so, you know, there's plenty of assets out there you could use to, you know, to do better than I. Okay, so that's it. I hope you found it useful, and I'll talk to you again another time.